Welcome to Spotlight Murders. I'm your host, Kieran Caldwell, and today we're diving deep into one of the most complex, controversial, and ultimately unsolved cases in music history. The murder of Tupac Shakur on September 7th, 1996, in Las Vegas. But this isn't just about that fatal night. This is about a web of conspiracy, corruption, gang violence, and cover-ups that stretches from the streets of Compton to the corridors of the LAPD, from Death Row Records' Tarzana studios to the halls of federal law enforcement. Over the next hour, we'll examine evidence that's never been fully connected, witness testimonies that were silenced, and ask the questions that law enforcement seemed afraid to pursue. So buckle up, because this story goes much deeper than you think. Craving a true crime podcast that unravels deep secrets and dark conspiracies? Scoob is an AI-powered podcast that serves up sharp, binge-worthy episodes, exploring infamous cases like Tupac's unsolved murder, Gianni Versace's murder, Tata LaBianca murders, and more. Join thousands of listeners hungry for justice, untold stories, and raw investigations. Download Scoob today, available on the App Store and Play Store. Now let's start where it all began. September 7th, 1996, Las Vegas. Picture this. Suge Knight, the imposing head of Death Row Records, has just watched Mike Tyson pummel Bruce Seldon in 109 seconds at the MGM Grand. The Death Row entourage is riding high, planning to hit the 662 Club to celebrate. But Suge has other plans. He wants to make an entrance, wants to stop by his house first. Tupac Shakur, fresh off watching the fight, wants to drive his own Hummer with his friend Frank Alexander, but Suge convinces him otherwise. "We need to talk," he tells Tupac. "Join me in the BMW." This decision would cost Tupac his life. The convoy that followed was pure death row excess. Mercedes, BMWs, Cadillacs, and Lexuses rolling through Vegas like a hip-hop parade. Inside Suge's black BMW, they're blasting Tupac's newest creation, the Machiavelli album, at ear-splitting volume, so loud that a bicycle cop has to pull them over just to tell them to turn it down. Frank Alexander, following behind in another car, hoped Suge would take Tropicana Avenue to enter the club discreetly from behind. Instead, Suge runs a red light and veers onto Flamingo Road, turning Tupac's arrival into a public spectacle. This is where things get interesting. Cars full of fans, especially young women, start following the convoy. Alexander, who's unarmed, begins to feel uneasy as more and more vehicles join their procession. When they stop at a red light at Corville Lane, the scene becomes chaotic. Pedestrians and drivers alike are trying to catch a glimpse of Tupac. Then it happens. A white Cadillac skids to a halt slightly ahead and to the right of Suge's BMW. Inside are four young black men. The one in the left rear seat rolls down his window and pulls out a .40 caliber Glock. Between 10 and 15 shots ring out into the BMW's passenger side. Among approximately 100 witnesses, many watch in horror as Tupac tries to escape by diving into the back seat. But it's too late. 4 bullets find their mark across his torso, erasing part of his iconic Thug Life tattoo and wounding his hand and leg. The white Cadillac makes a quick right onto Corville and disappears into the Vegas night. But here's what's strange. Instead of immediately calling 911, Suge Knight makes a bold U-turn against traffic, forcing other cars to swerve out of the way. 2 bicycle officers who heard the gunfire give chase, but they only catch up because 2 of the BMW's tires were shot out in the attack. When Suge finally stops, the officers approach with guns drawn. Suge emerges with blood streaming down one side of his head, claiming he was hit too. But as chaos erupts around the crime scene, something disturbing happens. The crowd of onlookers begins treating the BMW like a souvenir stand, ripping off side view mirrors, wheel hubcaps, and door handles while police try to maintain order. The scene clears quickly, witnesses scatter, and the white Cadillac vanishes into Vegas traffic. Tupac Shakur, just 25 years old, clings to life as he's rushed to University Medical Center. He would never leave that hospital alive. 6 days. That's how long Tupac fought for his life in that Las Vegas hospital. 6 days of medical teams trying to save him. 6 days of fans holding vigil outside. And 6 days for investigators to gather evidence and interview witnesses. Among those witnesses was a young man who could have changed the entire trajectory of this case. His name was Yafeu Fula, but everyone knew him by his stage name, Kadafi. He was a member of Tupac's group, the Outlaws, and he was there that night. Wayne Peterson, a homicide lieutenant at the time, would later say that Fula was the only witness during initial interviews who indicated he might be able to identify the gunman. His exact words were chilling in their simplicity. "Yeah, I might be able to recognize him." Think about that for a moment. In a case with 100 witnesses, only one person steps forward and says they might be able to identify the shooter. This should have been the break investigators needed, but it never happened. After leaving Las Vegas, every attempt by detectives to schedule a follow-up interview with Fula hit the same roadblock. They were rerouted to Death Row Records attorney David Kenner. The same David Kenner who was making it difficult for police to interview Suge Knight. And then, before any meeting could take place, Yafeu Fula was silenced forever. November 13th, 1996. Just 2 months after Tupac's murder. Fula is visiting his girlfriend at a federal housing project on Mechanic Street in Orange, New Jersey. At 3:48 in the morning, someone approaches him in a third-floor hallway and shoots him at close range. He's found slumped against the wall, rushed to University Hospital in Newark, but dies at 1 p.m. that same day. Born on a Sunday, died on a Sunday, just like his fallen friend Tupac. Here's what makes this even more tragic. Bruce "Fatal" Washington, another Outlaws member, revealed that Fula and other group members regularly wore bulletproof vests for protection, especially after Tupac's murder. But it didn't matter. This wasn't a random shooting from a distance. This was an execution. The parallels are eerie. Just like Tupac, Fula was shot shortly after attending a highly publicized boxing match, the Tyson vs. Evander Holyfield fight in Las Vegas. Just like Tupac, he was killed when he might have been able to provide crucial information about the murder. Within 48 hours, Orange police arrested 2 teenagers, Kasim Nadir Way and Rashad Clark. Both were minors, both from the area. The official line? This was just local street violence, completely unrelated to Tupac's murder. Las Vegas investigators publicly agreed, but privately, LVMPD Sergeant Manning had a different take. While he agreed that decisions needed to be evidence-based rather than instinct-driven, he couldn't shake the feeling that Fula's death was connected to Tupac's. The timing was just too convenient. Think about it. The one witness who says he might be able to identify Tupac's killer is murdered 2 months later. In the criminal justice system, that's what we call a hell of a coincidence. While investigators were dealing with the loss of their key witness, another crucial figure in this case was dealing with threats from an unexpected source, the very people he was supposed to protect. Frank Alexander was Tupac's bodyguard, and from the moment this case began, his story painted a picture of something much more complex than a random drive-by shooting. Alexander immediately noticed something strange about the altercation that started this whole chain of events. At the MGM Grand, after the Tyson fight, Tupac's entourage confronted Orlando Anderson, the man who would become the prime suspect. But Alexander observed that Anderson seemed to be waiting for them. He didn't try to flee when confronted by Tupac, Suge Knight, and a group of Bloods. For a bodyguard trained to read dangerous situations, this behavior was a red flag. But it's what happened after the shooting that really reveals the depth of this conspiracy. That same night, Suge Knight summoned Alexander to his Paradise Valley mansion. Picture this scene. They meet near a red swimming pool, the only light coming from the eerie glow of the Death Row emblem reflecting on the water. Suge gives Alexander his story. Tell the police that Orlando Anderson snatched a chain from Tupac. That's what started the fight. Alexander, wanting to get out of this situation as quickly as possible, agrees to tell the story Suge's way. But then, on September 13th, the day Tupac died, Suga's demeanor completely changes. Alexander is called back to the mansion, where Suge, his attorney David Kenner, and Death Row's head of security, Reggie Wright Jr., are waiting. Suddenly, Suge starts blaming Alexander for Tupac's death. "You should have been armed that night," he says, permit or no permit. The atmosphere becomes so tense that Alexander fears for his life. He's contemplating a quick escape when news of Tupac's death interrupts the meeting. Suge's attention shifts, and Alexander never sees Knight again. But the threats don't end there. When Suge faces trial for his involvement in the Orlando Anderson assault, attorneys Kenner and Milton Grimes start calling Alexander repeatedly, pressuring him to testify in Suge's defense. Alexander knows his testimony would actually favor the prosecution, not Knight. Then the warnings come. A friend from Right Way Protective Services tells Alexander there's a potential threat to his life from death row. A security guard connected to Reggie Wright Jr. echoes the same warning. Despite these threats, Alexander reaches out to Kenner, who reads him a transcript of his police interview over the phone. "It's a clear intimidation tactic. We know what you said. We know where you live." This is where the story gets really dark. Here's a bodyguard who was hired to protect Tupac, who witnessed the events that led to his death, and who's now being threatened by the very people who employed him. The message is clear: stay quiet or face the consequences. Now let's talk about Orlando Anderson, the man who became the prime suspect in Tupac's murder, because his story doesn't fit the typical narrative of a gang revenge killing. Anderson, known on the streets as Baby Lane, was indeed a member of the Southside Crips. But in almost every other way, he was completely different from your typical gang member. He had graduated high school. He had attended Compton College for a couple of semesters. His half-brother had graduated from UC Berkeley. Unlike other Southside Crips, Anderson didn't drink or use drugs. He had no tattoos. He had never been convicted of a crime as an adult. By age 23, he had fathered 4 children with different women. But here's the kicker. He had never held a job that required filing federal income taxes. So how was he supporting himself and his family? Detective Poole, who investigated this case extensively, noted that most of the evidence against Anderson came from anonymous informants. In the criminal justice system, that's usually a red flag. Anonymous tips can be valuable, but they can also be used to point investigations in predetermined directions. But there were certainly things that made Anderson look suspicious. First, his behavior at the MGM Grand was odd. When confronted by Tupac's entourage, he didn't try to run. He didn't seem angry. Frank Alexander found this strange. Most people would either fight back aggressively or try to get away. Anderson did neither. After the beating, security personnel at MGM tried to get Anderson to file a formal complaint against Suge Knight, Tupac, and the others involved in the assault. He refused. He was reluctant to even identify his attackers. When Corey Edwards encountered Anderson at the MGM bar shortly after the incident, Anderson simply said everything was cool. He didn't appear particularly disturbed by what had happened. For a gang member who had just been publicly humiliated by rivals, this was unusual behavior. Anderson was also connected to retaliatory violence against Peru Bloods following the murder of Bobby Finch, showing he was capable of gang-related violence. Tupac's estate eventually named Anderson as one of 2 defendants in a wrongful death lawsuit. The other defendant was Jerry Monk Bonds, who was allegedly seen driving a white Cadillac, similar to the murder vehicle, to an auto body shop in Compton. But even this evidence had problems. Corey Edwards told the LAPD that if the Cadillac described in newspapers was the murder weapon, it couldn't belong to Bonds. Bonds owned an old, beat-up early 1980s Cadillac, not the late model described by witnesses. Throughout it all, Anderson and his family maintained his innocence. In a CNN interview, Anderson said he feared for his life because he worried someone seeking revenge for Tupac would target him. Here's what's interesting. Anderson's fear turned out to be prophetic. On May 29, 1998, at a car wash in Compton, Orlando Anderson was shot and killed in what appeared to be a gang-related incident. He was 23 years old. Was Anderson the shooter that night in Vegas? The evidence suggests he might have been involved, but was he acting on his own, or was he part of something bigger? That question leads us down some very dark rabbit holes. In 2008, 12 years after Tupac's murder, a confession surfaced that would change everything we thought we knew about this case. Dwayne Keefe D. Davis, Orlando Anderson's uncle, came forward with a story that pointed the finger at one of the biggest names in hip-hop. Davis, a longtime member of the Southside Crips, made a statement to a Los Angeles law enforcement task force investigating gang activity. What he said was explosive. Sean "Puffy" Combs had placed a $1 million bounty on both Suge Knight and Tupac Shakur. According to Davis, this conversation took place during the Southern California leg of Combs' 1995 Summer Jam Tour, when Bad Boy Records allegedly employed members of the Crips as security. During discussions about the escalating East Coast-West Coast rap feud, Davis claimed Combs made what seemed like an offhand comment expressing frustration with Suge and Tupac, offering a reward for their elimination. Davis admitted that Anderson was the shooter, but painted it not as a random act of gang retaliation, but as a calculated murder for hire. But here's where Davis's credibility becomes questionable. He expressed annoyance that Combs never paid the alleged bounty. This suggests his motivation for coming forward might have been financial rather than seeking justice. Despite the sensational nature of these claims, neither the Los Angeles Police Department nor the District Attorney's Office pursued the case further. They cited lack of supporting evidence. Former LAPD detective Greg Kading, however, took a different approach. He publicized aspects of Davis's statements in his self-published book, Murder Rap, revealing details of the long-standing gang members' allegations. But let's think about this logically. Would Sean Combs, at the height of his career, really put out a $1 million hit on Tupac and Suge? It seems almost too Hollywood, too neat and tidy. The East Coast-West Coast feud was real. The animosity between Death Row and Bad Boy was genuine. There were real threats, real violence, and real fear on both sides. But a $1 million bounty? What we do know is that violence in the rap world was escalating rapidly in the mid-90s. The shooting at Quad Studios in 1994 had already put everyone on edge. Tupac believed Biggie and Puffy were involved in that shooting, though they denied it. We also know that the Crips did provide security for Biggie when he visited Los Angeles. This is documented fact. Whether this relationship extended to contract killings is another matter entirely. The problem with Davis's confession is that it came so late, and it came from someone who had clear motivation to implicate others while reducing his own culpability. In the criminal justice system, deathbed confessions and jailhouse revelations are often treated with skepticism for good reason. But it raises an important question. If this wasn't just random gang violence, if there was orchestration from higher up, how high did it go? While investigators were chasing gang members and rap moguls, evidence was emerging that the corruption in this case might extend into law enforcement itself. Richard McCauley was an LAPD officer who seemed to be everywhere this case touched. He worked security for Death Row Records. He was seen at the hospital where Tupac lay dying. And he was in Las Vegas the night of the shooting, despite officially being on medical leave. The LAPD's internal affairs investigation into McCauley was tellingly slow. It wasn't until 3 months after Las Vegas police contacted Kenneth Knox, a detective investigating Death Row Records, that internal affairs really began their inquiry. When Sergeant John Ianson finally traveled to Las Vegas in May 1997 to collect testimonies, what he found was damning. Approximately 12 witnesses claimed to have seen McCauley working as a private security guard outside Tupac's hospital room. 4 hospital security officers specifically noted that McCauley had openly talked about being a member of the LAPD. They described him as light-skinned, green-eyed, and muscular, distinctive features that made him memorable. But here's what really caught their attention. Macaulay was driving an expensive, late-model Mercedes. Hospital staff wondered how a police officer could afford such a vehicle on his salary. Macaulay had told them he frequently worked for Tupac and that Suge Knight had brought him to Las Vegas from Los Angeles, specifically to provide additional protection for the rapper. When the LAPD checked work records from Death Row Records, they found that Macaulay had been working at the label's studios throughout the spring of 1996, long after his work permit had been revoked, and while he was supposedly on medical leave from his police duties. During his May 27, 1997 interview, Macaulay's story was full of holes. He claimed he only worked at Death Row once, the night he met Detective Knox in October 1995. He said he had signed an agreement to end his association with Right Way Protective Services and had honored that commitment. Macaulay admitted to being in Nevada around the time of Tupac's death, but claimed he was visiting his grandmother in Henderson, about 15 miles from Las Vegas. He denied attending the Tyson Seldon fight, denied witnessing the Orlando Anderson assault, and denied being part of the death row convoy when Tupac was shot. But then his story gets really weird. Macaulay said he returned to Los Angeles on September 8th, the day after the shooting, but went back to Las Vegas 2 days later. Why? To spend time with a young woman he'd met the previous weekend, whom he only identified as Renee. He described her as Asian with dyed black hair, but claimed he couldn't remember her last name, address, or phone number because he was married and had no further contact with her. When shown a hotel registration form for Luxor Room 7050 under his name and former Los Angeles address, Macaulay denied staying there. He speculated that his best friend, James Green, a Compton police officer, had used Macaulay's credit card to book the room because Green had recently gone through bankruptcy and divorce. Then, Macaulay changed his story, saying he himself had used the card to open the room account for Green. Most damning of all, Macaulay denied working security at the hospital where Tupac was treated. He claimed he only visited once to deliver food to James Green, who was working as part of Knight's security team. Sergeant Ianson informed Macaulay that he could face charges for providing false and misleading statements during an official investigation. 4 hospital security officers had positively identified Macaulay as being part of Death Row's security detail, and they remembered him bragging about his work with the LAPD. The implications here are staggering. If Macaulay was working for Death Row while being an active LAPD officer, it suggests a level of corruption that goes beyond just taking side jobs. It suggests that Death Row had someone inside law enforcement, someone who could provide information, influence investigations, or protect the label's interests. To understand how deep this corruption went, we need to look inside Death Row Records itself, because by 1996, the label had become something far more dangerous than a music company. Kenneth Knox was an LAPD detective who had been investigating Death Row as part of a civil abatement action. What he discovered was a criminal enterprise hiding behind platinum albums and celebrity glamour. The first crack in Death Row's facade came on July 30th, 1996, when Kevin Lewis, a Death Row manager, made an urgent 911 call. Lewis had been attacked in the label's parking lot by 2 men with baseball bats. They beat him unconscious, leaving him with 8 stitches in his head, 4 more in his neck, and multiple cuts and bruises. Before this attack, Lewis had been hostile and antagonistic toward the LAPD. When Knox told him that police officers couldn't work for Death Row, Lewis had suggested they could make money by creating an album about officers being unable to protect Snoop Dogg. He reportedly called all white Death Row employees punk rockers he employed as personal slaves. But the beating changed Lewis completely. Initially, he told police he knew who attacked him and who ordered the attack. Then, the next day, he retracted everything, claiming he didn't know his attackers or their motives. Despite being a former college athlete and physically imposing figure, Lewis was visibly shaken and expressed fear of retaliation. This incident marked a turning point. Lewis began cooperating with authorities, providing inside information that would prove crucial to understanding death row's operations. Meanwhile, federal agents Dan McMullen of the FBI and John Ciccone of the ATF were running a task force focused on death row records. Their intelligence linked Suge Knight and the company to a gun smuggling and narcotics distribution network operating from the Nickerson Gardens housing project. Knox compiled a comprehensive list of gang members associated with the label. Reggie Wright Jr., death row's head of security, openly admitted that Suge Knight's personal protectors were armed members of the Bloods gang. The threats against Suge were very real. Knox learned of death threats from multiple sources. There were allegedly 3 contracts on Knight's life from groups including the Rolling 60s Crips and the Bounty Hunter Kill Squad. As a result, Knight traveled in convoys of 5 vehicles when moving between locations. The violence kept escalating. On October 1, 1996, 8 LAPD officers responded to a disturbance at Death Row's Tarzana studios. A fight had occurred involving a gang member with a metal chair, but the security guard was uncooperative, claiming not to know the identities of those involved. The building's night manager confirmed that several gang members were still inside and warned of potential further violence. LAPD evacuated the premises and detained 13 suspects, including 7 Mob Piru Bloods members. One was wearing a bulletproof vest, though no firearms were found. But here's where it gets really interesting. On October 10th, an LAPD officer told Knox that a friend had recently sold Suge Knight a yacht and suspected it was being used for smuggling narcotics and firearms from Mexico into the United States. That same day, Kevin Lewis expressed concerns about an internal security issue within Death Row, though he wouldn't provide specifics. His fear had been heightened by Tupac's murder. 5 days later, police discovered something that connected all these threads. Officers responding to a prowler call near Death Row's studios found bills of sale for 2 Glock pistols, a utility bill addressed to Death Row Records, and a receipt linked to David Kenner from a nearby dry cleaner. The next day, 3 members of Tupac's Outlaw Immortals were arrested in Georgia for attempting to rob a liquor store with a gun stolen from a home near Death Row's studios. 2 days after that, Suge Knight was questioned as a potential prowler at a condo in Woodland Hills. Knight claimed to live there with his girlfriend, but had lost his keys. Police discovered that David Kenner rented the condo, which was occupied by a woman named Latricia Johnson. Vehicle registrations for a Jeep Cherokee and Mercedes at the location were in Kenner's name. When Suge was finally incarcerated for violating his probation, Kevin Lewis immediately called Knox seeking police protection. In exchange, he offered to share substantial information about recent events at Death Row Records. What Lewis revealed painted a picture of a company that had completely lost control, where violence was routine, where gang members outnumbered music industry professionals, and where criminal activity was not just tolerated, but actively facilitated by management. Want to dive into the real story behind the fame and uncover dark secrets? Scoob brings you fast-paced, binge-worthy, true crime episodes that uncover corruption, gang violence, and untold conspiracies behind the scenes. Join thousands of listeners exploring the dangerous world lurking beneath the spotlight. Download Scoob now, available on the App Store and Play Store. Now, getting back to Tupac Shakur's case, the fallout from his death unleashed chaos across the city. Tupac's murder didn't end the violence. It triggered an all-out war on the streets of Compton that would claim multiple lives and validate investigators' worst fears about gang retaliation. James Lloyd, also known as Lil Caesar, was connected to the notorious BIGGIE and provided investigators with a detailed account of the 1993 Quad Studios shooting that had escalated tensions between East and West Coast artists. Lloyd described being on the 8th floor with Biggie and Puffy, waiting for Tupac's arrival. When he saw Tupac approaching on the sidewalk, Lloyd went down to meet him as Biggie had requested. But by the time his elevator reached the ground floor, Tupac had already been shot. Despite Tupac's suspicions that Biggie and Puffy were involved in that shooting, Lloyd denied any knowledge of such a plot. But he acknowledged the persistent animosity between Bad Boy Records and Death Row Records that had plagued them in multiple cities. When LAPD detectives Poole and Miller traveled to Las Vegas in May 1997 to work with their counterparts, there was a consensus that Tupac's murder was somehow connected to Biggie's death 6 months later. The theory was simple. If Crips affiliated with Bad Boy had killed Tupac, then Bloods affiliated with Death Row would retaliate by killing Biggie. Unverified informants were telling investigators that Puffy Combs was responsible for orchestrating Tupac's murder. Suge Knight had told others that Combs was behind the murder of Jake Robles, an alleged associate of Knight's. But the most immediate validation of the retaliation theory came from the streets of Compton itself. Corey Edwards provided the LAPD with a sworn affidavit explaining the dynamic. Since Southside Crips were believed responsible for Tupac's murder, everyone in Crips territory knew that Mob Peru, the blood said associated with Suge Knight, would seek revenge in their neighborhood. Although Tupac wasn't originally from Mob Peru, his close alignment with Suge Knight tied him to their faction. Residents were warned to be cautious, but not everyone heeded the advice. The violence began almost immediately. 2 days after Tupac's shooting, on September 9th, 1996, Darnell Brims, a young Southside Crips member who was allegedly present during Tupac's murder, found himself in a liquor store at the intersection of Alondra Boulevard and Atlantic Avenue. This was a volatile boundary between Crips and Bloods territories. A Blood gang member suddenly appeared, armed with a firearm, and shot Brims 3 times. But in an act that probably saved his life, Brims used his body to shield young Laketia McNeese from harm. This selfless act seemed to give the shooter pause, allowing both Brims and McNeese to survive the attack. The cycle continued. 2 Mob Peru members survived a drive-by shooting on North Bradenfield Street. A Blood who had family working for a security firm narrowly survived an attack by Crips in a blue blazer at a local intersection. The streets were in chaos. Every corner could be a potential ambush site. Every intersection was a possible battlefield. Young men who might have grown up together were now hunting each other based on colors and affiliations. This wasn't random violence. This was systematic retaliation. Each shooting was a response to the previous one. Each death demanded another death. And Tupac's murder had lit the fuse on a powder keg that had been building for years. The gang warfare that erupted after September 7th, 1996, proved what investigators had suspected all along. Tupac's murder wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a larger conflict between organized criminal enterprises that happened to be connected to the music industry. 6 months after Tupac's murder, on March 9th, 1997, Christopher Wallace, the notorious BIGGIE, was gunned down outside the Peterson Automotive Museum in Los Angeles. If investigators needed proof that these murders were connected, the retaliation cycle provided it. But the Biggie investigation would reveal an even darker truth. Death Row Records had its own designated hitman, and his name was Wardell Poochie Fouse. Foose was a longtime member of the Looters Park Peru gang and, according to FBI and ATF investigations, a regular enforcer for Suge Knight. He was suspected of either directly committing several murders or ordering others to carry them out. A 1997 interview conducted by Federal Task Force agents with Blood gang member Anthony Welch painted a chilling picture of how Suge Knight's operation worked. Welch told the FBI about William Ratcliffe, an up-and-coming rapper associated with the Bounty Hunters gang from Nickerson Gardens. Ratcliffe desperately wanted a recording contract with Death Row Records and had even confronted Suge Knight in a bathroom during a video shoot, accompanied by 10 fellow bounty hunters demanding a deal. Suge, never one to tolerate disrespect, reportedly declared that Ratcliffe's days were numbered. According to Welch's account, Suge summoned Poochie to a recording studio where he was overseeing a session. The orders were simple: take care of Ratcliffe. The next day, Ratcliffe was cornered on Central Avenue in Compton and executed. When informed of the killing, Suge supposedly said about Poochie, "He doesn't mess around. That's exactly how I want him to do it." But Poochie's most significant alleged crime was yet to come. Roderick Reed, a member of the Fruittown Piru gang, serving time for drug and weapons charges, began writing letters to Kevin Hackey, a former Compton school officer who had been involved in Russell Poole's investigation. Reed seemed to believe Hackey could help with his appeal and began sharing information about death row records through an imprisoned insider connected to Reed's PCP operation. Throughout the summer months, Reed made repeated claims in his letters that Poochie Faust was the hitman Suge Knight used to assassinate Christopher Wallace in direct retaliation for Tupac's murder. In one late August letter, Reed brazenly stated, "I know about Poochie murder Biggie Smalls." In subsequent correspondence, he expressed fear for his own safety, worrying he might disappear because of his knowledge about Poochie's involvement in Biggie's murder. Reed's claims lacked concrete evidence, and investigators couldn't pursue the information directly because the U.S. attorney handling Reed's case wanted to let his appeal conclude first, potentially using Reed as an informant later in exchange for sentencing considerations. But in early May 2009, new circumstantial evidence emerged from a source deemed much more credible than Roderick Reed, giving new life to the theory that Poochie Faust was Biggie's killer. Poochie himself never faced justice for these alleged crimes. In 2003, he was shot 10 times in the back while riding his motorcycle through Compton, becoming another casualty in the ongoing cycle of violence that Tupac's murder had set in motion. The theory that Biggie's murder was retaliation for Tupac's creates a neat narrative. East Coast kills West Coast. West Coast retaliates by killing East Coast. But like everything else in this case, the reality was probably much more complex. What's undeniable is that both murders remain officially unsolved. Both were connected to the same networks of gang members and music industry figures. And both victims were young black men whose artistic genius was silenced by bullets on American streets. In any complex criminal investigation, certain pieces of evidence take on almost mythical significance. In the Tupac and Biggie cases, one such piece was a vintage Chevrolet Impala that seemed to appear everywhere the investigation touched. The Impala first gained notoriety as the vehicle used in the drive-by shooting outside the Peterson Automotive Museum where Biggie was killed. But there was another Impala, one directly connected to Suge Knight, that tells its own fascinating story about the web of relationships surrounding these murders. In 1996, Suge Knight commissioned Juventino Yanez, an auto restoration expert who, according to a 1999 DEA report, was also a notorious cocaine distributor allegedly moving up to 50 kilograms weekly from his auto shop. But Suge's business with Yanez was legitimate, at least this time. For $30,000, Yanez was hired to restore a classic 1961 Impala to showroom condition. The car was intended as a gift for Tupac Shakur, complete with an airbrush design of the cover art from Tupac's All Eyes on Me album. It was meant to be the ultimate tribute from mentor to protege, a symbol of Tupac's success and Suge's generosity. But Tupac would never see this extravagant present. He was killed in Las Vegas just before the car's completion. After Tupac's death, the Impala's ownership became complicated. Initially, Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, reportedly received the car from Suge as a memento of her son. However, despite losing physical possession of the vehicle, Yanez maintained ownership of the pink slip, the legal document proving ownership. The Impala changed hands multiple times, eventually ending up with Armando Hermosillo, a body shop owner from El Monte. Hermosillo purchased the vehicle for $15,000 without the pink slip and obtained a duplicate title, proudly displaying the iconic car outside his business to attract customers. During the late summer of 2006, Yanez's son spotted the Impala at Hermosillo's shop and informed his father. Yanez paid a visit, firmly maintaining that he had built the car for Suge Knight and felt entitled to it. He expressed that he had pulled a lot of time for those guys, a reference to a prison sentence he'd served following the discovery of weapons in his garage. Despite Yanez's claims, Hermosillo refused to give up the Impala. Shortly after, Yanez's son returned to the shop with a group of Bloods gang members. The intimidation didn't work until Hermosillo was handed a mobile phone with Suge Knight on the other end. Suge's message was clear and threatening. "That car belongs to the industry. Give it over. I have my own cops. I'll call them. You know what I can do to you." Faced with these threats, Hermosillo stepped aside and watched as the Impala was loaded onto a flatbed tow truck and driven away. This incident, occurring 10 years after Tupac's death, demonstrates the lasting power Suge Knight wielded even from behind bars. The phrase, "I have my own cops," is particularly chilling, suggesting ongoing corruption and influence within law enforcement. The Impala story also illustrates how everything connected to Tupac's legacy became valuable, fought over, and ultimately controlled by the same criminal networks that may have been responsible for his death. But perhaps most importantly, it shows how Suge Knight's reach extended far beyond the music industry. He could mobilize gang members, threaten business owners, and claim to have law enforcement connections a full decade after the peak of death row's power. The fate of that restored 1961 Impala remains unknown, but its journey through the criminal underworld of Los Angeles serves as a perfect metaphor for how Tupac's memory was exploited and monetized by the very people who may have been responsible for cutting his life short. The story of what happened to Tupac's body after his death adds another layer of mystery to an already complex case, raising questions about whether there was a deliberate attempt to hide evidence or simply a family's desire for privacy and dignity. Tupac spent 6 days in a coma in the intensive care unit at University Medical Center before dying on September 13th, 1996. During this time, friends and relatives were allowed to visit him, but security was tight due to the high-profile nature of the case and concerns about retaliation. Dale Pugh, a representative from the University Medical Center, explained that when Tupac's body left the hospital, the media didn't witness it. This decision was made to avoid turning the event into a public spectacle and to respect both Tupac and his family. Given the large crowd gathered outside the hospital and the uncertain security situation, the hospital chose an alternate exit for the body. Following his death, Tupac's mother, Afeni Shakur, arrived to positively identify him at the hospital. His body was then swiftly transported to the coroner's office for autopsy. Coroner Ron Flood emphasized that standard autopsy procedure includes the presence of multiple people: the pathologist, forensic technician, crime scene analyst, and detectives. Flood noted the improbability of any conspiracy or cover-up given the number of people involved in the process. But here's where the timeline becomes interesting and suspicious to some. A decision involving Clark County Coroner Flood, a sergeant, and 2 homicide detectives was made to proceed with the autopsy that same evening. While autopsies are commonly conducted on the same day, bodies are received in Las Vegas, especially in homicide cases. The urgency was partly attributed to security concerns. Many people knew the coroner's office was located near the hospital, where a vigil had formed after the shooting. Officials were worried about security risks if they kept Tupac's body at the morgue overnight. Homicide Sergeant Manning and Detectives Becker and Franks were present during the autopsy, ensuring thorough documentation and examination. Once completed, the coroner transferred Tupac's body to Davis Funeral Home, located across the street from the hospital at 2127 West Charleston Boulevard. It's presumed that Afeni Shakur chose this mortuary due to its proximity to both the hospital and coroner's office, as well as its convenience while she stayed at the Golden Nugget downtown. Then came the decision that would fuel conspiracy theories for decades. At Afeni Shakur's request, Tupac's body was cremated overnight by the mortuary. The official explanation for cremation rather than burial was logistical, the complexity of transporting a body between states. But critics have pointed out that this destroyed any possibility of future forensic examination. After cremation, a small private memorial service was held at the Las Vegas funeral parlor, attended by only a few family members and friends. Shortly after the service, Afeni flew back to her home in Stone Mountain, Georgia, near Atlanta, just a little over 24 hours after her son was declared dead. Tupac's ashes were later scattered in a park in Los Angeles, a location significant to him since he had spent his recent years there. The informal scattering was a quiet affair attended by a small circle of family and friends. For conspiracy theorists, the rapid cremation eliminates the possibility of future forensic examination that might reveal additional evidence about the shooting or potentially contradict official findings. For Tupac's family and supporters, it was simply a mother's decision to handle her son's death with dignity and privacy. The speed of the entire process, from death to cremation in less than 24 hours, remains unusual but not necessarily suspicious. In the context of a high-profile murder case with ongoing security concerns and a grieving family trying to maintain some privacy, the decisions made by Afeni Shakur seem understandable. But in a case filled with unanswered questions, cover-ups, and corruption, even routine decisions take on sinister undertones. Ready to peel back the layers of the most infamous celebrity murders and the shadowy world around it? Powered by AI and trusted by thousands of listeners across the U.S., Scoob takes you inside the tangled web of shady connections, corruption, and unanswered questions that shaped celebrity murders. We explore the untold stories behind the headlines, revealing what really went down in the streets and studios. For a true dive into one of stardom's darkest mysteries, Scoob is where the story begins. Raw, revealing, relentless. Because beneath the glitz and glamour, there always lies a maze of secrets that few have dared to unravel. So here we are, nearly 3 decades after that fatal night in Las Vegas. And what do we really know? We know that Tupac Shakur was murdered in a drive-by shooting on September 7th, 1996. We know that the investigation was compromised from the beginning by uncooperative witnesses, corrupt police officers, and a culture of silence that valued loyalty over justice. We know that Orlando Anderson was the prime suspect, but he was killed before he could be properly investigated or tried. We know that the only witness who said he might be able to identify the shooter was murdered 2 months later in New Jersey. We know that Death Row Records was not just a music label, but a criminal enterprise with deep connections to gang members, corrupt law enforcement, and systematic violence. We know that Suge Knight had enemies who wanted him dead, and allies who were willing to kill for him. We know that the murder sparked a cycle of retaliation that claimed multiple lives, and that Biggie Small's murder 6 months later was likely connected to Tupac's death. We know that there were federal investigations into gun smuggling, drug distribution, and racketeering that touched everyone involved in this case. We know that evidence was destroyed, witnesses were silenced, and investigations were sabotaged. But what we don't know is who ultimately gave the order to kill Tupac Shakur. Was it a spontaneous act of gang retaliation by Orlando Anderson and his Crips associates, seeking revenge for the beating at the MGM Grand? The evidence suggests Anderson was the shooter, but the circumstances around the shooting suggest it wasn't spontaneous. Was it orchestrated by Sean Combs as part of the East Coast-West Coast rivalry, with $1 million bounty motivating Crips to eliminate Death Row's biggest star? The confession of Keefe D suggests this, but his credibility is questionable and his motives suspect. Was it an inside job by Death Row Records itself, with Suge Knight eliminating Tupac because the rapper was planning to leave the label? This theory explains the strange behavior of Death Row associates after the shooting, but it seems to lack a clear motive. Was it the result of LAPD corruption, with dirty cops either facilitating the murder or covering it up afterward? The Richard McCauley investigation suggests law enforcement corruption, but doesn't necessarily point to murder conspiracy. Or was it some combination of all these factors? A perfect storm of gang rivalry, industry corruption, police misconduct, and criminal enterprise that created conditions where a young artist's life could be eliminated with impunity? The truth is probably more complex than any single theory. What we're dealing with is not just a murder case, but a symptom of systemic problems that plagued American society in the 1990s. The drug war's impact on communities, the militarization of gang culture, the corruption of institutions, and the exploitation of Black artistic talent by criminal enterprises. Tupac Shakur was more than just a rapper. He was a poet, activist, and voice for a generation. His death silenced not just an artist, but a cultural force that was challenging power structures and speaking truth to authority. The fact that his murder remains officially unsolved nearly 30 years later is not just a failure of the criminal justice system. It's a symbol of how America treats its most vulnerable and valuable voices. In the end, the real tragedy is not just that we lost Tupac Shakur, but that we lost him to a system that values profit over people, silence over truth, and loyalty to criminal enterprises over justice for victims. The case may never be officially solved, but the lessons it teaches us about corruption, conspiracy, and the cost of violence are as relevant today as they were in 1996. That's all for today's episode of Spotlight Murders. Until next time, keep questioning, keep investigating, and never stop seeking the truth.